"This is hilarious." The judge burst into laughter, shaking his head as he flipped through a stack of documents. The entire courtroom followed, chuckling, whispering, and waiting for the final blow. He finally looked up, his mocking gaze settling on Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary, sitting calmly at the defense table. "Miss Leavitt, do you actually think you're smarter than the law?" he scoffed. "You're just a kid playing politics. You don't belong here." Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. The prosecutor smirked, leaning back in his chair. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and the audience buzzed with amusement. But Karoline, she didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't blink. The judge chuckled again, tapping his gavel lightly. "This isn't Twitter, Miss Leavitt. You can't just post a clever comeback and expect to win a trial." The courtroom exploded with laughter. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, looking smug. They all thought this would be an easy victory. They had no idea what was coming. Stay tuned, because what Karoline does next will leave everyone speechless. The laughter slowly faded as the prosecutor stood, straightening his grey suit and adjusting his tie with an air of confidence. He stepped forward, his polished black shoes clicking against the wooden floor, and turned to the jury with a knowing smile. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "We are here today because Miss Leavitt knowingly and deliberately broke the law." The courtroom fell into an attentive silence. She abused her position as White House press secretary to manipulate public opinion, spreading false information about U.S. tax policies, and in doing so she violated the Hatch Act, which strictly prohibits government officials from using their public office for political gain. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously, some already drafting headlines. "White House official accused of misconduct." Karoline sat motionless, her face unreadable. The judge leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly, unimpressed. He tapped his fingers against the bench before speaking. "Miss Leavitt, do you have anything to say?" His voice was laced with sarcasm. "Or are you just another internet influencer who thinks real life is like Twitter?" The room erupted in laughter again. Even a few jurors smirked. The prosecutor's grin widened as he turned to Karoline, arms crossed. "Well?" Cameras flashed, eager to capture what they expected to be a career-ending moment. Still, Karoline didn't move. She let the laughter settle, let the chuckles fade into murmurs, let the silence stretch. Then slowly, she tilted her head, a ghost of a smile forming at the corner of her lips. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice cool and unwavering. The prosecutor's smirk faltered for the briefest second. The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Karoline leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her blue eyes locked onto the prosecutor. "Because if you're done with the theatrics," she said, flipping open a thick binder of documents, "I'd like to talk about what the law actually says." The entire courtroom fell silent. What happened next, no one saw coming. Stay with us because Karoline is about to flip this trial upside down. The courtroom was silent now. All eyes were on Karoline Leavitt, but she didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She didn't even shift in her seat. Instead, she simply sat there, her hands lightly folded on the table, her posture perfectly still. The camera zoomed in on her face, her sharp blue eyes unwavering, cold, calculated. For the first time that day, the energy in the room changed. The judge, who had spent the past few minutes mocking her, suddenly stopped smirking. The prosecutor, who had just delivered his passionate accusations, cleared his throat and adjusted his tie, suddenly uncomfortable with the silence. The crowd shifted uneasily. The same people who had laughed at her moments ago now found themselves holding their breath. Something about her calmness felt dangerous. But the prosecutor wasn't having it. With a sharp sneer, he pointed toward Karoline and turned to the jury. "See? She has nothing to say." His voice rang through the courtroom. "That silence? That's not confidence. That's guilt." A few reporters nodded. already framing their headlines. Karoline Leavitt crumbles under pressure. The prosecutor leaned in, speaking as if he were explaining to a child. "Miss Leavitt, this is your last chance to defend yourself, if you even can." More laughter rippled through the gallery. But Karoline remained still. No reaction, no panic, just that same eerie calm. Then she exhaled slowly. And for the first time she sat back in her chair, crossed her arms, and tilted her head slightly as if observing something amusing. She let a small, knowing smirk tug at the corner of her lips. That's when people started to realize something was off. The mood in the courtroom changed. Reporters stopped writing, their pens hovering midair. The jury exchanged glances. Even the judge, who had been enjoying the prosecutor's attacks, suddenly wasn't smiling anymore. Karoline finally spoke. Her voice was smooth, unshaken, dripping with quiet confidence. "Are you done?" The prosecutor's smile flickered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. She let the silence drag for another second, then leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table. "Because if you're done with the theatrics..." She reached for the thick binder of legal documents in front of her and flipped it open, her fingertips skimming across the highlighted sections. "I'd like to talk about what the law actually says." The air in the room shifted. The judge narrowed his eyes, adjusting his glasses. He hadn't expected this. Karoline ignored the tension, flipping through her pages casually, almost like she was grading an assignment. "You see," she continued, her voice cool, "the prosecution has done a wonderful job of making this case sound dramatic. They've thrown around big words: abuse of power, manipulating public opinion, violating the Hatch Act." She glanced up, locking eyes with the prosecutor. Very compelling, but also completely incorrect. A few whispers rose from the back of the courtroom. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. "The Hatch Act," she said, tapping her finger on a section of text, "was written in 1939. It was designed to prevent government officials from directly influencing elections." Elections. She looked at the jury now. "Can someone tell me when the next US election is?" Silence. She turned back to the judge. "Because last I checked, my statement about Canada's tax policy wasn't tied to any election. Which means..." She flipped to another highlighted section. "This law doesn't even apply to me." The prosecutor shot up from his chair, his voice rising. "Objection. She's twisting the intent of the law." Karoline didn't even blink. "Am I?" she asked, tilting her head. "Or am I simply reading it out loud?" She slid the document across the table, straight toward the judge. The judge picked it up, scanning the lines. His smirk was gone now. The prosecutor's face turned red. He had spent weeks preparing this case. He wasn't about to let some 27-year-old press secretary take it apart. "This is just legal gymnastics," he snapped. "The intent of the law." "The law doesn't work on intent," Karoline interrupted, standing up now. Her voice was sharper, louder. "It works on facts, and the facts say you have no case." The jury leaned forward. The audience was dead silent. Reporters, who had once been ready to bury Karoline, were now intrigued. Karoline walked toward the judge's bench, picking up another document from her binder. "And let's talk about this so-called abuse of power," she continued, flipping a page. "This isn't the first time the Hatch Act has been challenged in court. In fact, in 2018, the case of Jenkins v. State Department set a precedent." She turned the binder toward the jury, pointing to a specific passage, stating that if a law is outdated and does not explicitly define an action as a violation, it cannot be enforced retroactively. More murmurs rippled through the room. The judge sat up straighter, scanning the case law. The prosecutor? He was silent now. Karoline smiled slightly. "I've been silent this whole time," she said, looking at the prosecutor now. "Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was waiting for you to finish digging your own grave." The jury gasped. The prosecutor's face drained of color. For the first time in the entire trial, it was him, not Karoline, who had nothing to say. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. For minutes, Karoline had let the prosecution paint her as a criminal, let them mock her, let the judge dismiss her as a naive girl who didn't belong. But now, it was her turn. She stood up slowly, adjusting the lapels of her navy blazer with an air of quiet confidence. The soft rustle of fabric was the only sound in the room. Then she smiled slight, not out of nervousness, not out of arrogance, but like someone who knew they were about to win. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, her voice calm but firm, "I was just letting the prosecution entertain us." She tilted her head, letting the words linger before adding, "But now, it's my turn." The room froze. No more laughter, no more whispers. Even the judge's smirk faded slightly as he shifted in his chair. Karoline reached down and lifted a thick stack of documents, neatly clipped together, pages already highlighted. She didn't look rushed. She didn't look afraid. She looked like someone who had walked into battle fully prepared to win. Karoline flipped open the first page of her binder and ran a finger across a highlighted section. The courtroom was dead silent, waiting. "The prosecution wants you to believe I broke the law," she began, her voice measured and steady. "That I misused my position as White House press secretary to push a political agenda." She looked directly at the jury. "But there's a problem with their argument." She tapped the document in front of her. The law they're citing was written in 1939. The jury frowned, shifting in their seats. The judge raised an eyebrow, suddenly more alert. "Let me say that again," Karoline continued, her tone deliberate. "The Hatch Act was written before television was mainstream, before cell phones existed, before the internet, before social media, before X, before TikTok, before live streaming, before modern digital communication as we know it." She turned toward the prosecutor now, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "So tell me, Counselor, how exactly does a law from 1939 apply to something that wasn't invented for another 80 years? A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled away. Even the judge, who had been smirking earlier, now looked interested. "And let's talk about precedent," Karoline said, flipping to another section in her binder, "because this isn't the first time the Hatch Act has been questioned in court." She lifted a separate document, holding it up for the jury to see. In 2018, the case of Jenkins versus State Department set a clear legal precedent. The court ruled that if a law is outdated and does not explicitly define an action as a violation, it cannot be enforced retroactively. The jury leaned forward, the weight of her words sinking in. Karoline took a step closer. "In simpler terms," she continued, "if the law doesn't say something is illegal, then it's not illegal." The judge exhaled sharply, tapping his gavel against the bench, a sign he was processing what she just said. "This is nonsense," the prosecutor suddenly shouted, slamming his hand against the table. "The law is the law." Karoline tilted her head, a slow, deliberate movement. "Then why did a judge rule differently in a similar case just last year?" Silence. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into a fist. He wasn't expecting this. Karoline let the moment stretch just long enough before continuing. "The law is not a one-size-fits-all rulebook," she said smoothly. "It evolves. And when a law from 1939 is used to punish speech in 2025, the courts have to decide, are we enforcing justice, or are we just looking for someone to punish?" She turned to the judge now. "Your Honor, I believe the answer is obvious." The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through his own copy of the case law. The prosecutor, once so smug, was now pale, his confidence crumbling. "This case was built on an outdated law," Karoline continued, looking directly at the jury, "a law that has already been challenged and reinterpreted in modern times." She paused, letting her next words land like a hammer strike. "Which means this entire trial," she leaned forward, "should never have happened in the first place." The jury gasped. The judge pressed his lips into a thin line, his expression unreadable. For the first time all day, The prosecutor had no words. He swallowed hard, eyes darting to his notes as if searching for a lifeline. But there wasn't one, because Karoline had just dismantled his entire case. What happens next will leave even the judge speechless. Keep watching. The courtroom was dead silent, still reeling from Karoline's brutal takedown of the prosecution's case. The jury was leaning in, the judge had stopped smirking, and the prosecutor, once so smug, was shifting uncomfortably in his chair. It was clear. Karoline was winning. And then, "Your Honor," the prosecutor suddenly jumped to his feet, his voice loud, almost frantic. "We have new evidence." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Karoline raised an eyebrow, unfazed. The prosecutor pulled a small USB drive from his pocket, holding it up like a trophy. "This," he declared, "is an unreleased recording from the White House press briefing on the 15th of February. It proves beyond a doubt that Miss Leavitt abused her position." The jury exchanged glances. The judge leaned forward, suddenly more interested. The prosecutor hurried to the courtroom clerk, handing over the USB. A screen lowered from the ceiling, and within seconds, the audio began to play. Karoline's voice echoed through the speakers. "Canada is on its knees because of our tax policies." A few jurors frowned. Some reporters whispered. But then, "And honestly," her recorded voice continued, "they deserve it for standing against America." The crowd gasped. The tension in the room shifted instantly. The prosecutor grinned smugly, whispering to his assistant, "We've got her now." The judge's expression darkened as he turned to Karoline. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice heavy, "would you care to explain this?" Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. The jury sat stiffly, absorbing the words. For the first time, it looked like Karoline was in serious trouble. But Karoline, she simply exhaled through her nose, tilting her head slightly like a teacher watching a student make a mistake. She glanced at the prosecutor, then at the judge, then back at the screen. Then, finally, she spoke. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "I'm going to ask a very simple question." She turned to the prosecutor, her voice laced with amusement. "If this recording is so crucial, why wasn't it presented at the beginning of the trial?" The prosecutor's smirk twitched slightly. Karoline leaned forward, hands resting lightly on the table. "I mean, if you had such damning evidence, why wait until now?" She let the question hang in the air. A few jurors looked at each other, something clicking in their minds. The judge narrowed his eyes. The prosecutor cleared his throat, scrambling for an answer. "It was just submitted this morning," he said quickly, "but that doesn't change the fact that it proves." "Oh, but it does," Karoline interrupted, standing up now, "because it tells me one of two things." She held up a single finger. "One, you had this recording all along but deliberately withheld it, which would be a violation of legal procedure." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. She held up a second finger. "Or two, this was conveniently discovered at the last minute because you needed a Hail Mary." The prosecutor's jaw clenched. The jury was watching him now, waiting for his response. Karoline turned to the judge now, her voice cool and firm. "Your Honor, I request a forensic analysis of this recording, specifically the metadata. I want to know when it was last edited." A wave of shock rolled through the room. The prosecutor flinched visibly. The judge paused, considering. "Counselor," he said, turning to the prosecutor, "can you verify this recording's origin?" A bead of sweat rolled down the prosecutor's forehead. His assistant shuffled through papers, avoiding eye contact. The prosecutor licked his lips. He looked at Karoline, then at the judge, then back at the jury. For the first time all trial, he had no answer. And just like that, the energy in the courtroom shifted again. And just when you think this case can't get any crazier, wait till you see what Karoline does next. The courtroom was silent, every eye locked on Karoline. But she didn't flinch. She didn't panic. Instead, she leaned in slightly, resting her elbows on the table. a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, her voice carrying across the room, "just for the record, when was this recording submitted?" The prosecutor froze. The confident smirk he'd worn just moments ago disappeared. Yesterday," he admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "But—" Karoline's smile widened, her head tilting just slightly like a chess player who had just trapped her opponent's king. "So why wasn't it included in the original case files?" she asked. A sharp gasp spread through the crowd. The jury shifted in their seats. The judge raised an eyebrow, now looking skeptical. The prosecutor swallowed hard, his hands gripping the table. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Karoline folded her arms, letting the silence stretch. Then she dropped the bombshell. "Your Honor, I request an analysis of the file's metadata," she said, her voice firm and confident. The room erupted in murmurs. Reporters whispered frantically, cameras zooming in on her poised expression. The judge looked at the prosecutor. "Counselor?" he asked, his tone suddenly more serious. The prosecutor's face paled. He glanced at his assistant, who shuffled through papers, avoiding eye contact. Karoline leaned forward, pressing the advantage. "It's simple," she said, locking eyes with the judge. "The metadata will tell us exactly when this file was last edited. If this is a genuine recording, then there's nothing to worry about." She paused. "But if it's been tampered with—" She let the sentence trail off, letting the weight of her words sink in. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "I'll allow the request," he said finally. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, his face tight with frustration, because he knew this wasn't just a request. It was checkmate. The truth is about to be exposed. Stay tuned. The courtroom expert plugged in the USB, fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. A large screen flickered to life, displaying the file's hidden metadata, digital fingerprints of its creation and edits. The room was silent, anticipation thick in the air. The expert adjusted his glasses, squinting at the screen. Then he froze. "Your Honor," he began, clearing his throat. "This file was last modified." He paused, scanning the data again to be sure. He turned to the judge, his voice suddenly sharper, after the trial had already begun. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, reporters whispering furiously, jurors exchanging wide-eyed glances. A few spectators laughed in disbelief. The judge's face darkened as he turned slowly to the prosecutor, his jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the bench. Then he slammed his gavel down hard. "Counselor," he said, his voice dangerously low, "what is the meaning of this?" The prosecutor paled. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Your Honor, too wasn't aware," he stammered, fumbling through his notes, eyes darting to his assistant. "There must be some mistake." "A mistake?" the judge snapped, glaring at him. "This evidence was deliberately altered. In my courtroom. Do you realize how serious this is?" The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. Because there was nothing he could say, Karoline took a slow breath, then stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth but cutting, "this case was never about the law. It was never about justice." She turned, sweeping her gaze across the jury, across the courtroom, letting the weight of her words sink in. "It was about silencing me." Silence. The prosecutor lowered his head, defeated. The jury looked at Karoline now not as a defendant, but as someone who had just exposed something bigger than a simple trial. The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. This case had just taken a turn no one expected. And Karoline wasn't finished yet. "Watch closely, Karoline is about to land the final blow." The courtroom was frozen in time. Every eye was locked on Judge Holloway, who sat rubbing his temples, his fingers pressing into his forehead as if trying to process the disaster unfolding before him. He let out a long sigh, finally lowering his hand and turning his gaze to the prosecutor, a look filled with pure disgust. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice tight with barely contained frustration, "I came into this trial thinking Miss Leavitt was just another politician trying to twist the law in her favor." He paused. The room was dead silent. The prosecutor sat motionless, his face pale, his hands gripping the table as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. The jury held their breath. The judge exhaled sharply. "But I was wrong." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Reporters' pens hovered mid-air, cameras zooming in, capturing this moment in history. Even Karoline, composed Karoline, tilted her head slightly, watching the judge with sharp eyes. The judge sat back in his chair, scanning the room before his expression hardened. "Not only is she right," he said, his voice carrying through the courtroom, "but the prosecution deliberately tampered with evidence." The prosecutor flinched. The jury exchanged stunned glances. "This trial," the judge continued, "should never have happened." A pause. A breath. Then, case dismissed. The courtroom exploded. Reporters scrambled for their phones, news alerts flashing across their screens. Trump supporters in the gallery cheered. Some leapt to their feet, clapping, fists raised in victory. The prosecutor slumped in his chair, face ashen, staring blankly at the documents in front of him, the same documents Karoline had shredded with logic and truth. The judge banged his gavel. "Order! Order!" But there was no stopping the chaos now. Karoline didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply exhaled, a small smirk playing on her lips as she quietly gathered her documents, neatly stacking them in her binder. She had walked into this courtroom accused, and she was walking out victorious. And just when you think it's over, Karoline's next move will change everything. The moment Karoline stepped outside, a wall of reporters swarmed toward her, microphones raised, cameras flashing like a chaotic storm. "Miss Leavitt! Miss Leavitt!" Voices shouted from all directions. The Washington air was crisp, the energy outside the courthouse electric. Spectators, political analysts, and Trump supporters stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for her first words. One reporter pushed forward, breathless. "How does it feel to win?" Karoline paused, her sharp blue eyes scanning the crowd. Then she smiled slightly, tucking a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "It's not about me," she said smoothly, her voice steady despite the chaos. "It's about truth, winning over lies." A murmur spread through the crowd. Reporters jotted down notes. Another journalist, wearing a press badge, leaned forward. "Do you believe this case was politically motivated?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, then exhaled. "I believe the facts speak for themselves," she replied simply. The crowd erupted in more questions, cameras zooming in. But Karoline was done talking. She walked toward a sleek black SUV, the door held open by her security detail. She paused for a moment, glancing back at the flashing lights, the shouting voices, the whirlwind she had just walked through. Then, without another word, she stepped inside. As the door clicked shut, the world outside kept buzzing. But inside, Karoline Leavitt was at peace. The moment Karoline's SUV pulled away from the courthouse, the internet exploded. Within minutes, Karoline wins shot to the top of X, formerly Twitter, racking up millions of posts. Conservative influencers flooded the timeline. Karoline Leavitt just humiliated the establishment on live television. Legend. Memes took over. A screenshot of the prosecutor's pale, defeated face. "Don't mess with Karoline." A clip of her dismantling the case. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is how you school the legal system." Then, the Trump himself tweeted, "Karoline just schooled the legal system. MAGA strong, proud of her." His tweet alone had 1 million likes in 10 minutes. Liberals and conservatives clashed in the replies. "She destroyed them. This isn't justice. This is a joke. Future President Karoline." Meanwhile, on TikTok, Clips of the trial racked up millions of views under the hashtag number Caroline-the system. One viral video. Side by side of the judge laughing at the start, then ruling in Caroline's favor at the end. Caption? That's what we call a plot twist. Even mainstream media couldn't ignore it. CNN. Karoline Leavitt's victory raises serious legal questions about outdated laws. Fox News. Karoline Leavitt exposes the system. What's next for her? Her name was everywhere. And deep in Washington, politicians took notice. One day later, the White House briefing room was packed more crowded than usual. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, cameras positioned at every angle, microphones raised in anticipation. And then, the moment they had all been waiting for, Karoline Leavitt stepped up to the podium. She was poised, confident, completely unfazed. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer, she adjusted the mic, scanning the room with those sharp blue eyes. A few reporters exchanged glances. She had just walked out of one of the most shocking courtroom battles in history, and here she was, back at work as if nothing had happened. A journalist from the front row leaned forward. "Miss Leavitt, after everything that happened in court, what's next for you?" The room fell silent. For a moment, Karoline simply looked at him, letting the question linger. Then, slowly, she flashed her signature smirk. "Oh," she said smoothly, "I'm just getting started." The room erupted. Some reporters chuckled. Others frantically typed out her words for the next round of headlines. Cameras clicked non-stop. In the back of the room, a young staffer whispered to a colleague, "She's not just a press secretary anymore. She's a movement." If you loved watching Karoline take down the system, make sure to subscribe. More stories of truth, power, and justice are coming your way. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss a single moment, because this is just the beginning.